Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable it feels to be the only person standing when everyone else is sitting, or the only one walking against the crowd? There's this visceral uneasiness that creeps through your body, almost like a warning signal. Your brain starts firing questions. Am I wrong? Am I missing something? Should I turn around? I've spent decades studying neural oscillations, and what fascinates me is this: that discomfort you feel isn't weakness or insecurity. It's millions of years of evolution encoded into the rhythmic patterns of your neurons. Your brain is literally designed to synchronize with others, to find safety and meaning in collective patterns. But here's what most people don't realize. That same mechanism that kept our ancestors alive is now quietly shaping every decision you make, often without you even knowing it. Before we start, if you genuinely enjoy these videos, consider subscribing to our channel and comment what city and time you're watching from. I'm really curious where everyone is tuning in from. Now, I want to take you on a journey today that might change how you see yourself and every choice you've ever made. We're going to explore something I've dedicated my life to understanding: the neuroscience of conformity, and why following the crowd doesn't just feel comfortable, it feels necessary. You see, most people think that when they go along with others, they're being weak or mindless. But what I've discovered through years of research into brain dynamics is far more interesting and far more human than that. Your brain isn't just passively observing the crowd. It's actively synchronizing with it, creating rhythmic patterns of neural activity that literally change your perception of reality. Here's what you're going to learn in the next 50 minutes. First, we're going to look at the actual mechanics of how your neurons fire in patterns that mirror the people around you. I'm talking about measurable oscillations, brain waves that synchronize between individuals without you even being aware it's happening. Second, we're going to explore why this synchronization feels so good, why there's a neurochemical reward system that floods your brain with dopamine and oxytocin when you align with the group. And third, we're going to examine the flip side, why standing alone triggers ancient threat detection systems that make you feel like you're in physical danger, even when you're perfectly safe. But I'm not just going to give you theory. I'm going to share stories from my own research, moments in laboratories where I watched brain patterns synchronize in real time between people who had never met. I'm going to tell you about times in my own life when I felt that pull of the crowd and had to make conscious choices about whether to follow or stand apart. And most importantly, I'm going to give you practical tools to recognize when your brain is being influenced by collective patterns versus when you're making genuinely independent choices. Because here's the truth that most neuroscience courses won't tell you: consciousness itself emerges from collective activity. You're not a lone brain operating in isolation. You're part of a vast network of synchronized neural patterns that connect you to every person you encounter. Understanding this doesn't mean you have to surrender to it. It means you can finally see the mechanisms at work and make conscious choices about when to synchronize and when to break away. The reason this matters so much right now is that we're living in a world where crowd dynamics have been weaponized. Social media, algorithms, advertising, political movements, they all understand what neuroscientists have known for decades. Humans are wired to conform, and that wiring can be exploited. If you don't understand how your own brain responds to collective patterns, you're vulnerable in ways you can't even see. You'll make decisions thinking they're yours, when really they're the product of neural synchronization you never consented to. So, my promise to you is this: by the end of this conversation, you'll be able to feel the difference in your own body between authentic choice and conformity-driven behavior. You'll understand why certain situations make you anxious or comfortable, And you'll have specific practices you can use every single day to maintain your capacity for independent thought while still enjoying the genuine benefits of social connection. This isn't about becoming a contrarian or rejecting all social influence. It's about becoming conscious of the most powerful force shaping your behavior so you can work with it intentionally instead of being controlled by it unconsciously. Let me start with a story that changed everything for me. It was 1986, and I was running experiments at UC Berkeley measuring electrical activity in the olfactory bulbs of rabbits. Now, I know that sounds like a strange place to begin a conversation about human conformity, but stay with me, because what I discovered in those rabbit brains revealed something profound about how all mammalian brains, including yours, actually work. I had electrodes implanted across the olfactory bulb, measuring neural activity while the rabbits were presented with different scents. What I expected to see was individual neurons firing in response to specific smells, like little switches turning on and off. But what I actually saw was something entirely different. The neurons weren't firing independently at all. They were oscillating together in waves, creating rhythmic patterns that swept across the entire olfactory bulb like ripples on a pond. The fascinating part was that these oscillations weren't just random. They were organized, coherent, synchronized. When the rabbit smelled something meaningful, something connected to food or danger, the neural oscillations would suddenly snap into a unified pattern. Millions of neurons that had been firing somewhat independently would suddenly lock into phase with each other, creating what we call a coherent state. It was like watching an orchestra where all the musicians suddenly start playing in perfect time, even though no conductor gave them a signal. I remember sitting in that dark laboratory, watching the oscilloscope traces dance across the screen, and realizing that I was looking at something fundamental about how brains create meaning. The rabbit wasn't recognizing the smell through individual neurons, each doing their own calculation. Recognition was emerging from the collective synchronized activity of millions of neurons working as a unified field. And here's where it gets interesting for understanding human conformity. When I expanded this research to look at neural synchronization between animals, I found something even more striking. When two rabbits were placed near each other, their brain oscillations would begin to synchronize. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. The rhythmic patterns in one rabbit's brain would influence the patterns in the other rabbit's brain, creating a kind of neural resonance between them. Now, I wasn't measuring conformity in rabbits. I was measuring something more basic. The fundamental tendency of neural oscillators to synchronize with other neural oscillators in their environment. But I realized that this mechanism, this tendency toward synchronization, might be the neurological foundation for something we see constantly in human behavior. The pull toward group alignment, the comfort of moving with the crowd, the discomfort of standing alone. Let me tell you about the first time I really felt this in my own life, not as a scientist, but as a human being. It was during a faculty meeting, probably 15 years into my career at Berkeley. The department was voting on a policy change that I privately disagreed with. As the conversation unfolded, I watched colleague after colleague voice their support. The reasons they gave were reasonable enough, but I kept thinking about the implications they weren't considering, the ways this policy might constrain future research or limit opportunities for certain students. I sat there, with my hand hovering near the table, rehearsing in my mind what I would say if I raised an objection. And I felt it. That physical sensation I'd experienced so many times before but never really examined. My heart rate increased. My palms started to sweat slightly. There was a tightness in my chest, a subtle nausea in my stomach. My body was sending me urgent signals. Danger, threat, risk. But here's the thing. There was no actual danger. These were my colleagues, people I'd worked with for years. The worst that could happen was a brief debate, maybe some mild disagreement. No one was going to attack me. My career wasn't at risk. And yet my body was responding as if I were about to step into physical danger, as if I were about to separate from the protective cover of the group and expose myself to predators. I didn't speak up that day. I sat quietly and voted with the majority, even though my mind disagreed. Afterward, I felt this strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that I hadn't subjected myself to the discomfort of standing alone. Disappointment that I'd let the opportunity pass to voice what I actually thought. It wasn't until later, when I started connecting my research on neural synchronization to human social behavior, that I understood what had actually happened in my body during that meeting. My brain had detected a mismatch between my internal state and the collective state of the group. This mismatch triggered ancient threat detection systems that evolved millions of years before faculty meetings or parliamentary procedures. These systems don't distinguish between physical separation from the tribe and intellectual disagreement with the consensus. They just register. You are out of sync with the group. You are vulnerable. You are at risk. Return to synchronization immediately. This is what I want you to understand deeply. The discomfort you feel when you're the only one with a different opinion or the only one moving in a different direction isn't a character flaw. It's not a sign that you're weak-minded or easily influenced. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, trying to keep you alive by keeping you synchronized with the social group. Now, let me take you deeper into the neuroscience, because once you understand the mechanisms, everything clicks into place. Your brain is essentially a collection of oscillators, billions of neurons firing in rhythmic patterns at different frequencies. Some oscillate slowly, in what we call delta waves, cycling once or twice per second. Others oscillate much faster, in gamma frequencies, cycling 30 to 100 times per second. And between these extremes are all the other frequencies. Theta, alpha, beta, each associated with different states of consciousness and different types of cognitive processing. The key insight from my research is that these oscillations aren't just internal brain activity. They're influenced by external rhythms, including the rhythms in other people's brains. When you're in close proximity to someone, especially when you're paying attention to them, your neural oscillations begin to synchronize with theirs. This happens through multiple channels. Visual perception of their movements, auditory processing of their speech rhythms, even subtle chemical signals we're not consciously aware of. There's a beautiful series of experiments done by Uri Hassan and his colleagues at Princeton that demonstrates this perfectly. They put people in MRI scanners and had them listen to the same story. What they found was remarkable. As the story unfolded, the brain activity patterns of different listeners began to synchronize, not just in the auditory processing areas, but throughout the brain, in regions associated with emotion, understanding, memory formation. The listeners' brains were literally oscillating together, creating shared patterns of neural activity. And here's the crucial part. The degree of neural synchronization predicted how well the listeners understood and remembered the story. The more their brains synchronized with the speaker's brain, the better they comprehended the message. This suggests that neural synchronization isn't just a side effect of communication, it's the mechanism of communication. We understand each other by temporarily becoming neurologically similar to each other. Now extend this to a group setting. Imagine you're in a room with 10 people, all focused on the same conversation. Through the mechanisms I just described, all of your brains are beginning to oscillate in increasingly similar patterns. You're creating what I call a collective neural state, a temporary unified field of synchronized brain activity, and when you're in that state, several important things happen. First, your perception narrows. Information that fits the collective pattern becomes more salient, easier to process, more compelling. Information that conflicts with the collective pattern becomes harder to perceive, easier to dismiss, less emotionally resonant. This isn't a conscious decision. It's happening at the level of neural oscillations, filtering what reaches your conscious awareness. Second, your emotional state aligns with the group. If the collective pattern is calm, you feel calm. If it's anxious, you feel anxious. If it's excited, you feel excited. This emotional synchronization happens through mirror neurons and empathy circuits, but it's amplified by the oscillatory synchronization. You're not just observing other people's emotions, you're neurologically recreating them in your own brain. Third, and this is crucial, your sense of certainty increases. When your brain is synchronized with a group, the collective pattern feels more real, more true, more obviously correct than any individual pattern could feel in isolation. This is because your brain uses coherence as a proxy for truth. A highly synchronized neural pattern feels like a clear, strong signal. A desynchronized pattern feels uncertain, weak, questionable. This is why groups become so confident even when they're completely wrong. It's not stupidity, it's neuroscience. When everyone's brain is oscillating in the same pattern, that pattern feels absolutely true to everyone involved. The neural mechanism that creates understanding also creates false certainty when it synchronizes around incorrect information. Let me share another research example that really illustrates this. Solomon Asch conducted his famous conformity experiments in the 1950s, where he had participants judge the length of lines in a group setting. The task was absurdly simple. Look at 3 lines and say which one matches the length of a target line. The correct answer was obvious. A child could do it. But Asch had confederates in the group who deliberately gave wrong answers. And a shocking percentage of real participants, about 75%, conformed to the group at least once, giving an answer they could clearly see was incorrect. For decades, psychologists interpreted this as social pressure, as fear of judgment or desire for approval. And those factors certainly played a role. But when I look at Asch's experiments through the lens of neural synchronization, I see something deeper happening. Those participants weren't just pretending to agree. Many of them actually began to perceive the lines differently. Their visual processing was being influenced by the collective neural state of the group. When everyone around you is confidently stating that line A matches the target, your brain receives that information not just as opinion, but as perceptual data. Your visual cortex starts to oscillate in patterns that match the collective perception. The line you initially saw as clearly wrong begins to look uncertain, ambiguous, possibly correct. Some participants reported afterward that they genuinely became confused about what they were seeing. That's neural synchronization overriding individual perception. Now, before this starts to sound dystopian, I want to emphasize something important. Neural synchronization is not inherently bad. In fact, it's essential for almost everything that makes us human. Language, music, dance, teamwork, empathy, love, all of these depend on our ability to synchronize our neural patterns with others. When you have a deep conversation with a friend and you both feel completely understood, that's neural synchronization creating genuine connection. When an orchestra plays in perfect harmony, that's neural synchronization creating beauty. When a sports team executes a complex play without anyone needing to speak, that's neural synchronization creating coordinated action. The problem isn't synchronization itself. The problem is unconscious synchronization, automatic alignment with collective patterns without awareness that it's happening. Because when you don't know your brain is being influenced, you can't make conscious choices about when to synchronize and when to maintain independent processing. Let me tell you about a moment when I became acutely aware of this in a different context. I was attending a large conference, maybe 500 neuroscientists packed into an auditorium. A prominent researcher was giving a keynote presentation about a new theory of consciousness. The theory was elegant ambitious, and according to my understanding of the data, fundamentally flawed. But as the presentation unfolded, I watched the audience's response. People were nodding, murmuring approval, clearly being swept up in the excitement of the ideas. I felt it again, that pull. The collective neural state in that room was one of enthusiasm and agreement. My brain was picking up those signals, those rhythms of approval and excitement. And I noticed my own thinking starting to shift. The objections I'd been formulating began to seem less important, more like nitpicking. The flaws in the theory began to look like minor details that could be worked out later. I found myself starting to nod along. But this time, because I'd been studying these mechanisms, I caught myself. I literally stopped and took a breath and asked, is my thinking changing because I'm genuinely seeing something new in the theory, or because my brain is synchronizing with the collective enthusiasm in this room? Once I asked that question, the influence became visible. I could feel the pull of the collective state, but I could also maintain enough distance to evaluate the theory on its own merits. This is the skill I want to teach you. The ability to feel neural synchronization happening without being completely controlled by it. Think of it like being in a current. If you don't know the current exists, it carries you wherever it goes. But if you can feel the current, you can choose whether to swim with it or against it or perpendicular to it. You're not fighting nature. You're working with it consciously. Now let's talk about the neurochemistry, because this is where the comfort part really comes in. When your brain successfully synchronizes with a group, your reward system activates. Specifically, your ventral striatum, a region deep in the center of your brain, releases dopamine. This is the same chemical that creates pleasure when you eat good food or receive a compliment or win a game. Your brain is literally rewarding you for synchronizing with others. At the same time, your hypothalamus releases oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone. Oxytocin creates feelings of trust, safety, and social connection. It's released during hugging, during breastfeeding, during positive social interactions. And it's also released during neural synchronization, during moments when your brain successfully aligns with a collective pattern. So when you follow the crowd, when you agree with the consensus, when you move in rhythm with the group, your brain floods you with chemicals that feel wonderful. You're not being manipulated by peer pressure in the way we usually think about it. You're experiencing genuine neurochemical pleasure that comes from successful social synchronization. Now, contrast that with what happens when you stand alone, when you disagree with the group, when you move against the crowd. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates. It interprets the desynchronization as potential danger. Remember, for most of human evolutionary history, being separated from your social group was genuinely life-threatening. You were vulnerable to predators, to starvation, to enemy tribes. Your brain evolved to treat social isolation as an emergency. When your amygdala activates, it triggers your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your stress response system. Your adrenal glands release cortisol, the stress hormone. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your muscles tense. You experience anxiety, discomfort, sometimes even nausea. All of this happens automatically, outside your conscious control, whenever you're significantly desynchronized from the people around you. So you have this powerful double mechanism. Pleasure when you synchronize, pain when you don't. This is why following the crowd feels so comfortable, and standing alone feels so uncomfortable. It's not weakness, it's biochemistry. Your brain is using the most fundamental motivational system it has, pleasure and pain, to push you towards synchronization with your social group. I remember a colleague once asked me, If this is all unconscious neuroscience, if we're just biological machines responding to oscillatory patterns and neurochemical signals, do we have free will at all? Can we ever really make independent choices? And I told him, that's exactly the wrong question. The right question is, can we become conscious of these mechanisms so we can work with them instead of being blindly controlled by them? Because here's what I've learned from decades of research and from my own life experience. Awareness changes everything. When you can feel neural synchronization happening, when you can notice the neurochemical pull toward conformity, you create a space for choice. You're not eliminating the biological mechanisms, you're adding a layer of conscious processing on top of them. And that conscious layer, though it's small and sometimes fragile, is where your genuine autonomy lives. Let me give you a concrete example from recent research that demonstrates this. Scientists at the Max Planck Institute did a study where they taught participants about conformity bias and the neural mechanisms behind it. Then they put these participants in ASH-type conformity experiments, situations where the group was giving obviously wrong answers. The participants who had learned about the neuroscience of conformity still felt the discomfort of disagreeing. Their stress response still activated, but they were significantly more likely to give accurate answers despite the group pressure. Why? Because they could recognize what was happening in their bodies and brains. They could feel the discomfort and think, this is my amygdala responding to desynchronization. This doesn't mean I'm actually in danger or that the group is actually correct. They could experience the neural pull without being controlled by it. This is what I mean by conscious choice. Not eliminating biological influence, but recognizing it and deciding how to respond. Now, I want to address something that might be occurring to you. If our brains are constantly synchronizing with others, if we're always being influenced by collective neural patterns, how is it possible that anyone ever has an original thought? How does innovation happen? How do we get diversity of thought instead of everyone thinking exactly the same thing? This is a crucial question, and the answer reveals something beautiful about how brains actually work. While it's true that neural synchronization is a powerful force, it's not the only force. Your brain also has what I call intrinsic dynamics, oscillatory patterns that emerge from your unique neural architecture, your specific history, your individual experiences and memories. These intrinsic dynamics create a kind of baseline pattern that's distinctly yours. When you encounter a group, your brain doesn't completely abandon its intrinsic dynamics. Instead, there's a negotiation between your individual pattern and the collective pattern. Sometimes the collective pattern is so strong that it overwhelms your individual pattern, and you synchronize completely. Other times, your individual pattern is strong enough that it persists even in the face of group pressure. And most often, you end up somewhere in between, partially synchronized, retaining some individual variation, while also aligning with the collective pattern. The strength of your intrinsic dynamics depends on several factors. Deep expertise in a domain creates strong intrinsic patterns that are hard to override. If you've spent years studying a subject, your brain has built robust neural networks that generate confident, coherent patterns of understanding. These patterns can resist conformity pressure more effectively than weak or uncertain patterns. Strong emotional connections to ideas or values also create powerful intrinsic dynamics. If you deeply care about something, if it's tied to your identity or your sense of meaning, your brain generates strong oscillatory patterns around it. These patterns are harder for collective dynamics to override. And here's something fascinating. Physiological factors matter too. Your overall stress level, your sleep quality, your nutrition, even your posture and breathing patterns. All of these influence the strength of your intrinsic neural dynamics. When you're well rested, well fed, physically relaxed, and breathing deeply, your brain generates more coherent intrinsic patterns. You're literally more capable of independent thought when your body is in a good state. This is why sleep deprivation and stress are such effective tools for creating conformity. They don't just make you tired, they weaken your intrinsic neural dynamics, making you more susceptible to synchronizing with external patterns. Cult leaders understand this instinctively. Even if they don't know the neuroscience, keep people exhausted, keep them stressed, and they lose the neural coherence needed to resist group patterns. But let me come back to something more immediate and practical. You might be wondering, how do I know in any given moment whether I'm thinking independently or just following the crowd? How can I tell if an opinion is genuinely mine, or if it's the result of unconscious neural synchronization? This is where we need to talk about metacognition, thinking about thinking. Your brain has the capacity to observe its own processes, to notice what's happening in your mind without being completely identified with it. This capacity isn't perfect, and it takes practice to develop, but it's the key to recognizing conformity influence in real time. Here's what I've learned to pay attention to. First, notice your body. When you're about to express an opinion or make a decision, pause for a moment and scan your physical sensations. Do you feel tense or relaxed? Is your jaw clenched? Are your shoulders raised? Is your breathing shallow or deep? If you're feeling tense, that's often a sign that some part of you is in conflict, either suppressing a different opinion to align with the group or pushing yourself to disagree when you'd prefer to synchronize. Genuine, independent thought, in my experience, often comes with a feeling of physical ease, even when the thought itself is challenging. There's a sense of alignment between your body and your mind. You're not fighting yourself. On the other hand, forced conformity often comes with subtle physical tension, a sense of holding something back or pushing something down. Second, notice the timing and source of your thoughts. Did this opinion emerge from your own processing, your own consideration of evidence and logic and experience? Or did it appear suddenly, fully formed, shortly after hearing someone else express it? There's a qualitative difference between thoughts that bubble up from your own intrinsic dynamics and thoughts that are essentially copied from external sources. This doesn't mean that all adopted thoughts are wrong. Sometimes you hear someone say something and you think, yes, exactly. They just articulated what I've been intuiting. That's different from hearing someone say something and thinking it because they said it. The first case involves recognition. The second involves unexamined synchronization. Third, notice your emotional relationship to the opinion. Do you care about this idea because it matters to you? Because it connects to your values and experiences and understanding? Or do you care about it because the people around you care about it? Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with caring about what your community cares about, but there's a difference between conscious, shared concern and unconscious emotional synchronization. I'll give you an example from my own life. For years, I held certain political views that were common in academic circles. If you'd asked me, I would have told you these were my carefully considered positions. But one day, I was having a conversation with someone outside academia, someone I respected, who held very different views. As I started to defend my positions, I realized I couldn't articulate why I believed what I believed. I could repeat arguments I'd heard others make, but I couldn't trace the logic back to my own experience and reasoning. That was a humbling moment. I realized that many of my political views were essentially conformity to my social environment. I'd synchronized my thinking with my colleagues without ever doing the deep individual processing required to make those views genuinely mine. Once I saw this, I didn't necessarily change all my views, but I did start the work of actually thinking through each position, examining the evidence, connecting it to my values, making conscious choices about what I actually believed versus what I'd absorbed unconsciously. This kind of examination can be uncomfortable. It's easier to assume that all your thoughts are authentically yours, but I believe this discomfort is necessary for intellectual integrity. If you never question whether you're thinking independently, you're almost certainly not thinking independently, at least not consistently. Now, let's talk about contexts, where conformity pressure is especially strong. I want you to understand that neural synchronization isn't uniform across all situations. There are specific contexts where the pull toward conformity becomes almost irresistible, where even awareness of the mechanisms isn't enough to fully counteract them. High-stakes social situations dramatically increase conformity pressure. When your membership in a group matters to your livelihood, your safety, or your identity, your brain's threat detection systems become hypervigilant. The potential cost of desynchronization seems enormous, so your brain pushes even harder toward alignment. This is why people often conform more strongly at work than with friends, or more with family than with strangers. Ambiguous situations also increase conformity. When you're uncertain about reality, when the correct answer isn't clear, your brain relies more heavily on social information to fill in the gaps. This is adaptive in many contexts. If you're in an unfamiliar environment and everyone else is acting calm, that's useful information that you're probably safe. But it also means that in complex, ambiguous domains like politics, economics, or philosophy, where correct answers aren't obvious, conformity pressure is especially strong. Authority presence is another major factor. When someone with high status or expertise is in the group, neural synchronization becomes even more powerful. Your brain treats authority figures as especially reliable sources of information, so it prioritizes synchronizing with them. The Milgram obedience experiments demonstrated this dramatically. People would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. And then there's the sheer size and uniformity of the group. The more people who agree on something, and the more unanimously they agree, the stronger the conformity pressure. This is because your brain uses consensus as a heuristic for truth. If everyone believes something, it's probably true, so your brain automatically starts to synchronize with the collective pattern. Breaking from unanimous consensus requires extraordinary neural coherence and often produces intense discomfort. I experienced this myself during the early days of COVID-19. In academic circles, there was rapid formation of consensus around certain policies and predictions. Some of these turned out to be accurate, others didn't. But in those early months, there was enormous pressure to align with the emerging consensus. Anyone who questioned it, even with reasonable scientific concerns, was quickly marginalized. I watched colleagues, smart people with relevant expertise, silence themselves rather than express uncertainty or disagreement, and I felt the pull myself. There were questions I wanted to raise, alternative hypotheses I wanted to explore, but the collective neural state was so strong, so unanimous, so emotionally charged that desynchronization felt almost impossible. The discomfort wasn't just social, it was visceral, neurological. My stress response would activate just thinking about speaking up. I did eventually speak up in some contexts, and the experience taught me something important. The discomfort of desynchronization doesn't go away just because you understand the neuroscience. Awareness helps, but it doesn't eliminate the biological response. You still feel the stress, the tension, the activation of threat detection systems. What changes is your relationship to those sensations. You can feel them without being controlled by them. You can act despite the discomfort rather than being paralyzed by it. This brings me to something I think is crucial. Courage, in the context of neuroscience. We usually think of courage as a personality trait, something you either have or don't have. But from a neurological perspective, courage is the capacity to act despite activation of threat detection systems. It's not the absence of fear or discomfort. It's the ability to feel those sensations and move forward anyway. And here's what's interesting. Courage is trainable. Just like you can build muscle through exercise, you can build neural pathways that allow you to tolerate desynchronization discomfort. Every time you notice conformity, pressure, and make a conscious choice about how to respond, you're strengthening the prefrontal circuits that enable independent thought. Every time you speak up despite the discomfort, you're training your nervous system that desynchronization isn't actually dangerous. This doesn't mean you should always disagree with groups or always swim against the current. That's just contrarianism, which is its own form of unconscious behavior. The goal isn't to never synchronize. It's to synchronize consciously, to choose when to align with collective patterns and when to maintain independent processing. Let me share one more research example that I think really illuminates this. There's a phenomenon called collective intelligence, where groups can sometimes make better decisions than individuals. This has been demonstrated in many contexts: prediction markets, wisdom of crowds, ensemble machine learning. When you aggregate independent judgments from many people, you often get more accurate results than any single expert could provide. But here's the key word: independent. Collective intelligence only works when people are making genuinely independent assessments. If everyone is just copying each other, if neural synchronization leads to conformity, then you lose the benefits of collective intelligence. You end up with what's called an information cascade, where early opinions disproportionately influence later ones, and the group converges on a consensus that might be completely wrong. This has profound implications. It means that the benefit of groups depends on individuals maintaining enough independence to contribute unique information and perspectives. But it also means that individuals benefit from group wisdom only when they can resist premature conformity and allow diverse views to emerge. This is the paradox we have to navigate. We need social connection and neural synchronization to function as humans, but we also need individual independence and cognitive diversity to function as intelligent communities. Too much conformity and we lose the benefits of collective intelligence. Too much independence and we lose the benefits of social coordination. The sweet spot is conscious navigation between these poles, knowing when to synchronize and when to differentiate. Now, I want to shift into the practical part of this conversation. I've given you a lot of neuroscience, a lot of theory. But the question that matters is, what do you actually do with this understanding? How do you live differently, knowing what you now know about neural synchronization and conformity? The first practice I recommend is what I call the synchronization scan. Several times a day, pause and ask yourself, am I currently synchronized with a group pattern, or am I in independent processing mode? You can feel this in your body and your thinking. When you're synchronized, there's often a sense of flow, of ease, of being carried by something larger than yourself. Your thoughts tend to align with what you've recently heard others say. Your emotions match the emotional tone of your environment. When you're in independent processing, there's more internal dialogue, more questioning, sometimes more uncertainty, but also more ownership of your thoughts. You're generating ideas from your own neural dynamics, rather than reflecting group dynamics. Neither state is better than the other. The point is simply to know which state you're in. Once you can reliably identify your synchronization state, the second practice is to consciously choose it. When you notice you're synchronized, ask, is this serving me right now? Is there value in synchronizing state, being aligned with this group pattern? Sometimes the answer is yes. If you're in a brainstorming session and ideas are flowing, synchronization might be exactly what you want. If you're at a concert and everyone's energy is building together, synchronization creates joy. But sometimes the answer is no. If you're in a meeting and you notice everyone agreeing on something you're uncertain about, that's a moment to consciously step into independent processing. This doesn't necessarily mean you speak up immediately, but it means you mentally create space between your thinking and the group's thinking. You maintain enough desynchronization to evaluate ideas on their merits rather than accepting them because everyone else has. The third practice is breath and body awareness. Remember, your physiological state influences the strength of your intrinsic neural dynamics. When you want to think independently, especially in high-pressure conformity situations, focus on your breathing. Slow, deep breaths activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which calms your threat response and allows your prefrontal cortex to function more effectively. I do this before any situation where I might need to disagree with a group. I take 2 minutes to breathe deeply, to relax my shoulders, to ground myself in my body. This isn't just stress management, it's neural preparation. I'm strengthening my intrinsic dynamics so they can maintain coherence even when confronted with strong collective patterns. The fourth practice is delayed response. When someone presents an idea or opinion, especially in a group setting, resist the urge to immediately agree or disagree. Your immediate reaction is usually heavily influenced by neural synchronization. Instead, tell yourself you'll think about it later, when you're alone, when you're not in the group's oscillatory field. I've made this a personal rule. I don't form final opinions about important topics while I'm in conversation about them. I listen, I engage, I ask questions, but I reserve judgment until later. Then, when I'm alone, I revisit the ideas. How do they sit with me now that I'm out of the group context? Do they still seem as compelling? What objections or alternatives occur to me now that didn't occur to me during the conversation? This practice has saved me countless times from adopting beliefs I didn't actually agree with. It creates a buffer between social influence and belief formation, giving my independent processing time to operate. The fifth practice is seeking out dissent. Your brain naturally gravitates toward people and information that confirm your existing patterns. This feels good because it reinforces synchronization with your chosen group, but it also traps you in echo chambers where conformity goes unexamined. Deliberately expose yourself to thoughtful people who disagree with you. Read books and articles that challenge your views. Have conversations with people outside your usual circles. This doesn't mean you have to change your mind about everything. It means you're giving your brain practice at evaluating ideas that don't come pre-synchronized with your social environment. I make it a point to regularly read researchers whose theoretical frameworks differ from mine. Sometimes I find flaws in their thinking, which strengthens my confidence in my own framework. Sometimes I discover insights I'd missed, which improves my understanding. Either way, I'm exercising the neural circuits needed for independent evaluation. The sixth practice is collaborative truth-seeking. This might sound paradoxical after everything I've said about conformity, but hear me out. The problem with conformity isn't synchronization itself, it's unconscious synchronization that prevents genuine collective intelligence. But when groups explicitly acknowledge conformity pressure and create structures to counteract it, they can achieve something no individual can achieve alone. This is why practices like devil's advocate, pre-mortem analysis, and anonymous voting exist. They're designed to protect individual independent processing while still allowing collective wisdom to emerge. When you're part of decision-making groups, advocate for these practices. Make conformity pressure explicit. Encourage people to voice disagreement. Create safety for desynchronization. I've been in research teams where we had a rotating role called the skeptic, whose job was to question every assumption and argument. This role gave someone permission and even obligation to desynchronize, which protected the group from premature consensus. It's a simple practice, but it dramatically improved our collective thinking. The seventh practice is self-compassion around conformity. You're going to conform sometimes. You're going to discover that opinions you thought were yours were actually absorbed from your environment. You're going to stay silent when you should speak up. You're going to agree when you actually disagree. This is inevitable because you're human and you have a human brain that evolved to synchronize. When this happens, don't spiral into shame or self-criticism. Shame actually strengthens conformity because it makes you more threat-sensitive and more desperate for group approval. Instead, notice what happened with curiosity. What was the conformity pressure? How did it feel in your body? What made independent thinking difficult in that moment? What might you do differently next time? I've conformed countless times in my life, even after decades of studying these mechanisms. Each time, I learn something about how conformity operates in me specifically. This ongoing learning is more valuable than achieving some impossible standard of constant independence. The eighth practice is building identity beyond groups. When your entire sense of self comes from group membership, conformity pressure becomes overwhelming because disagreeing with the group feels like self-destruction. But when you have a sense of self that includes but isn't limited to your group identities, you can disagree with groups without feeling like you're losing yourself. Cultivate relationships and activities that aren't connected to your primary social identities. If you're an academic, spend time with people outside academia. If you're politically engaged, have friendships that aren't organized around politics. If your identity is wrapped up in being a parent, maintain individual interests beyond parenting. This diversity of connection gives you neural patterns that aren't synchronized to any single group, which creates freedom. And finally, the ninth practice. Embrace productive solitude. Your brain needs regular time away from group influence to develop strong intrinsic dynamics. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit. It means scheduling regular periods where you're genuinely alone with your thoughts, not consuming media, not texting, not on social calls, just you and your mind. I take a long walk alone every morning. No phone, no podcasts, just walking and thinking. This time is sacred to me because it's when my intrinsic neural dynamics are strongest, when I can think most clearly without external synchronization pressure. Some of my best insights have come during these walks. Ideas that never would have emerged in the oscillatory field of group interaction. You might prefer meditation, journaling, hiking, or just sitting quietly. The specific activity matters less than the quality of solitude. Time when your brain is free to generate its own patterns without constantly adjusting to external social rhythms. Let me bring this all together now, because I want you to walk away from this conversation with a clear understanding of what I'm actually proposing. I'm not suggesting you become a contrarian or a loner. I'm not saying groups are bad or synchronization is something to avoid. What I'm suggesting is consciousness, awareness of one of the most powerful forces shaping your thoughts and behaviors. Your brain is designed to synchronize with others. This design is beautiful and necessary. It enables connection, communication, cooperation, all the things that make human life rich and meaningful. But it also makes you vulnerable to unconscious conformity, to adopting beliefs and behaviors without genuine understanding or agreement. The path forward isn't to eliminate synchronization. It's to make it conscious, to feel when it's happening, to notice the neurochemical pull toward group alignment and the threat response that activates during desynchronization, to understand that these are biological mechanisms, not moral failings, and then, from that place of awareness, to make choices about when to synchronize and when to maintain independence. This work is never finished. You don't achieve some final state of perfect conscious choice and then coast. Every day brings new situations where conformity pressure operates. Every conversation. Every decision, every opinion you form is influenced by the neural patterns of the people around you. The practice is ongoing awareness, continuous choice, moment-by-moment navigation between connection and independence. And here's what I've found in my own life. This awareness doesn't diminish the richness of social connection. If anything, it deepens it. When I synchronize with someone now, when I align my thinking with a group I'm part of, I do so more fully because I'm doing it consciously. I'm not being swept along unconsciously. I'm choosing to participate in collective patterns because I value what they create. And when I maintain independence, when I stand apart from group consensus, I can do so with less anxiety because I understand what's happening in my nervous system. The discomfort is still there, but I don't interpret it as a sign that I'm wrong or in danger. I recognize it as my threat detection system responding to desynchronization, and I can act despite that response. This is freedom. Not freedom from influence, but freedom within influence. Not independence from others, but conscious interdependence with others. Not isolation, but authentic participation in collective life with awareness of how collective patterns operate. The stakes of this work are higher than ever. We live in a world of unprecedented conformity, pressure, algorithmic amplification of group patterns, social media echo chambers, polarized tribal thinking. The neural mechanisms that evolved to keep our ancestors safe are being exploited at scale to manipulate behavior and belief. If you don't understand how your brain responds to collective patterns, you're vulnerable in ways you can't even see. But if you do understand, if you develop the practices I've described, you become part of the solution. You contribute to collective intelligence instead of information cascades. You model independent thought for others, which gives them permission to think independently. You participate in groups more authentically, which strengthens genuine connection rather than false consensus. This is the strange comfort of following the crowd. It feels so natural, so easy, so obviously right, because it's exactly what your brain evolved to do. But there's a deeper comfort available. The comfort of knowing yourself, of making conscious choices, of thinking your own thoughts while remaining connected to others. This comfort takes more effort, but it's worth every bit of that effort. So my invitation to you is this. Start noticing. Start paying attention to your synchronization state. Feel the pull of conformity and the discomfort of independence. Observe how your thinking changes in groups versus in solitude. Notice which opinions are truly yours and which you've absorbed without examination. This noticing is the beginning of everything. And be patient with yourself. This is subtle work. The mechanisms operate below conscious awareness most of the time. You'll miss them more often than you catch them at first. But gradually, with practice, you'll develop sensitivity to your own neural dynamics. You'll be able to feel synchronization happening. You'll recognize conformity pressure before it controls you. And you'll discover a kind of freedom you didn't know was possible. I've spent my career studying brains, trying to understand how consciousness emerges from billions of neurons firing in patterns. And what I've learned is this. Consciousness isn't just about what happens inside one brain. It's about the patterns that emerge between brains, the collective dynamics that arise when nervous systems interact. You are not just an individual. You're a node in a vast network of synchronized neural activity. Understanding this doesn't diminish your individuality. It reveals the true nature of individuality. Not isolation, but conscious participation in collective patterns. Not independence from others, but thoughtful navigation of, quote, interdependence. Not freedom from influence, but awareness of influence and choice within it. This is what I hope you take from this conversation. Not just information about neuroscience, but a lived understanding of how your own brain works in social contexts. Not just theory, but practices you can use every day to think more clearly and choose more consciously. Not just knowledge, but wisdom about how to be human in a world of constant social influence. The strange comfort of following the crowd will always be there. Your neurons will always want to synchronize. Your reward system will always flood you with pleasure when you align with groups. Your threat detection system will always activate when you stand alone. These mechanisms are permanent features of your nervous system. But you don't have to be controlled by them. You can feel them, understand them, work with them consciously. You can choose when to follow and when to lead, when to synchronize and when to differentiate, when to accept group wisdom, and when to trust your individual understanding. This is the path to authentic living in a social world. Not rejecting others, but knowing yourself well enough to be genuinely present with others. Not isolation, but conscious connection. Not independence, but interdependence with awareness. And that awareness, that consciousness of your own neural dynamics and the collective patterns that influence them, is perhaps the most distinctly human capacity we have. It's what allows us to be more than just biological machines responding to stimuli. It's what creates the possibility of genuine choice, real freedom, authentic life. So use this knowledge, practice these tools, develop this awareness, and as you do, you'll discover something beautiful. The more conscious you become of conformity mechanisms, the more you can appreciate genuine connection. The more you understand neural synchronization, the more you can choose it consciously and enjoy it fully. The more you recognize collective influence, the more freedom you have within it. This is my life's work, distilled into this conversation. This is what decades of studying neural oscillations and brain dynamics have taught me about being human. And this is my gift to you, the understanding that the discomfort of standing alone and the comfort of following the crowd are both just biology, and you are more than your biology when you become conscious of it. If this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Hit the like button to support the channel, and drop a comment sharing your own experience with conformity and independence. Where have you felt the pull of the crowd? When have you found the courage to stand alone? What practices help you think independently? I'd love to hear from you and learn from your experience, because even though I've studied these mechanisms for decades, I'm still learning how they operate in real human lives every single day. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next video.